So here we are in St. Catherine's Chapel. It's a side chapel of Sherborne Abbey. And here in the windows behind me, we have the oldest stained glass in Sherborne Abbey. It's medieval glass, it's from the 15th century, and it was put up sometime after the Great Fire in 1437. It was in the choir, and when the Puritans destroyed a lot of the medieval stained glass, it was the only parts that survived. It was then rediscovered in the 19th century when they were putting in new stained glass windows. And George Hamilton Fletcher, who actually has a memorial in this chapel, paid for it to be restored and re-leaded, the medieval stained glass, and placed in these windows. There's one window of medieval stained glass here, and there's another over here. 5 of the shields on the windows concern the Beaufort family. On the west window, we have a shield of Thomas Beaufort at the top left, and at the bottom we have, on the left, a shield of the Beaufort family, and on the right, another shield of the family. On the south window, we have 2 shields of the Beaufort family, both with a label indicating the eldest son. You can see 2 other examples of the Beaufort shield on the west window. These are without bordure, but otherwise they have the same elements as the previous shield of Thomas Beaufort. In particular, note the 3 lions, which symbolize England, and the 3 fleurs-de-lis, which symbolize France. This is ultimately a reference to the Beaufort, the castle in Champagne, which gave the Beaufort family its name. On the south window, we once again have 2 Beaufort shields without bordure. These examples, though, also have the so-called label. This is the element at the top, which looks like 3 T's. This indicates that these shields belong to the eldest sons of a lineage. The first of the non-Beaufort shields on the west window looks an awful lot like a Beaufort shield. The only difference is the bordure in argent and gules, or white and red, which is characteristic of the Vaux family. Nicholas Vaux fought for Henry VII at the Battle of the Bosworth Field in 1485, which ended the Wars of the Roses. He had a hand in organizing the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the extraordinary summit between Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France, which included banquets, tournaments, and masquerades. He was also an MP and a character in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. Finally, Nicholas Vaux was a protege of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, and this is probably what links the Vaux shield here with the Beaufort shields on the same window. Another non-Beaufort shield on the west window has, in fact, not yet been identified, so there isn't much that we can say about it. We can, though, say a lot more about the final non-Beaufort shield on the west window. This is the shield of Lawrence Kemys, and has a date, 1606, when Kemys was probably in his 40s. Kemys was a close associate of Sir Walter Raleigh, who built Sherborne Newcastle. In 1595, Kemys was in command of one of the 4 ships in Raleigh's expedition to Guyana. The following year, Kemys returned to Guyana without Walter Raleigh, and he came home telling how he had discovered a lake, Lake Parime, on which El Dorado, the mythical city of gold, was located. Raleigh was accused of conspiring against James I and imprisoned from 1603 to 1617. Released by James I in 1617 and given permission to explore again, Raleigh had one final chance to turn his career around, and Kemys came to him with an opportunity and a promise. He told him that he could find the mythical city of El Dorado, use the gold to return Raleigh to royal favor, and restore his good fortune. The expedition, however, was a disaster. When Kemys got involved with some of Raleigh's men in a skirmish with some Spanish soldiers against Raleigh's direct orders and in contravention of a peace agreement that had been signed by James with Spain. Worst of all, Raleigh's son was killed in the action. Kemys went to Raleigh and begged his forgiveness. Raleigh, though, by his own account, told Kemys that he had undone me in his obstinacy. And Kemys replied, "I know then, sir, what course to take." He then returned to his cabin, shot himself in the chest with a pistol, and because he'd still not died, he stabbed himself in the heart. Raleigh, for his part, was disgraced and arrested on his return to England. He was beheaded on the 29th of October, 1618. The first of the non-Beaufort shields on the south window is that of the Willoughby family. It has 4 quarters, with 2 of them sable with a gold cross for the Ufford family, the Earls of Suffolk, and for the Willoughbys 2 more quarters, which feature gules and a silver cross. You can see the same elements in this garter stall plate. The garter stall plates are brass plates in St. George Chapel at Windsor Palace, which show Knights of the Garter. This is the shield of William, the 5th Baron Willoughby, who was admitted to the Order of the Garter in 1402, in the time of Henry IV. The Abbey's information sheet suggests that this shield is that of William Willoughby of Turner's Piddle in South Dorset, which would give us a local link, and the information sheet dates this window to 1421. But the Willoughby whose shield is in St. George Chapel was dead by 1421, so this may instead be a later William Willoughby who donated 50 marks to Milton Abbey, not far from Turner's Piddle, and was buried in St. John the Baptist, Bear Regis, in 1512. The Abbey information sheet says this is the shield of a nobleman called Philip Fitzpaine, who was buried under the arch on the north side of the Abbey. This is the shield of Robert, the 1st Baron Fitzpaine, which features 3 lions passant guardant, that is, going past, looking our way, and argent or silver against gules or red, and finally with overall a bend azure, that is, a blue band across it all. This is clearly also what is featured on one half of this shield, and the fact that there is only one half is a cadency or custom signifying a younger branch of the family. The Fitzpaines were the barons of Oakford Fitzpaine near Sturminster Newton, only 25 kilometers or so from Sherborne, and we know that in 1317, Edward II granted permission for the abbot of the abbey to take in rents of up to £10, as long as they said a daily mass for the soul of the late king, of Robert Fitzpaine, and of all Christians. This is the shield of the Mountforts, a gentry family whose main lands were in Warwickshire. Here again it's useful to compare a full-color depiction of their shield. As you can see, it is bendy or and azure, that is, bands of yellow and blue, which you can see would have been the original colors on the stained glass in St. Catherine's Chapel. The Mountforts' main lands were in Warwickshire, but they did also hold lands in Dorset in the Middle Ages, and one William Mountfort was MP for Bridport in South Dorset in 1403, 1419, and 1422. And finally, we have the shield of Bath Abbey, or Bath Priory, as it was then. 2 keys, argent and or, that is, silver and gold, infiled or crossed by a sword argent with a hilt or, that is, a silver sword with a golden hilt, all against a background of azure or blue. This is at a time when the Romanesque cathedral church in Bath, begun in the early 12th century, had fallen into disrepair. There was, though, Bath Priory, which had 22 monks in 1485. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, on a visit from Wells, whose cathedral was in a better state, described the monks as all too eager to succumb to the temptations of the flesh, though which particular temptations of the flesh they had succumbed to is not clear. Besides heraldic shields, the windows in St. Catherine's Chapel also include human figures. Here on the south window, you can see 3 human figures across the center of the window. And here on the west window, you can see 4 such figures. Here they are again, up close. As you can see, the 2 central figures and the figure on the left have banners above their heads with words written in them. Here are the 2 central figures again from outside the abbey. And here they are again. The figure on the right has in the banner above his head the name Malachias, that is Malachi, one of the Old Testament prophets. And this figure in the banner above his head has Ossie, O-S-I-E, a version of Ossie, O-S-E-E, which appears in St. Jerome's Vulgate translation of the Bible for Hosea, another Old Testament prophet. These are then Old Testament prophets, although they're depicted in the usual late medieval manner, as late medieval pilgrims, with a hat, a beard, and usually a girdle with a bag hanging from it. At the bottom of the south window, there are also a number of heads, some of which have writing next to them. Since these all have halos, they are probably saints. The tops of the windows also contain a good deal of stained glass, much of it in the form of circles fitted into the cinquefoil pattern of the stonework, that is, the 5-leaf pattern that you can see at the top there. There's an interesting description of this part of the windows in an article that appeared in the Western Gazette on November the 23rd, 1923, soon after this glass was rediscovered in Sherborne Abbey and sent to the Victoria and Albert Museum for analysis. The most interesting remains, the article reads, are about a dozen heads of large cinquefoil main lights. These have the familiar 15th century circular medallions of suns, stars, roses, and other devices fitting into the cups, perhaps it should say the cusps, of the stonework. The other devices, besides the suns, stars, and roses that you can see there, include crowns, lions' heads, and IHS, the first 3 letters of the Greek name for Jesus, Jesus. The article goes on to say that these parts of the windows also include the upper portions of the background of the glass which filled the main lights. This, it says, is most unusual and exhibits very rare, if not unique, treatment consisting of a red or blue field crossed by a lattice of narrow bands of blue, red, white, or yellow. And that's what you see at the center of the cinquefoil pattern there. The general appearance of a window with this sort of a background, the article in the Western Gazette goes on to say, must have been dark and rich, somewhat reminiscent of the coloring of certain 13th century windows, such as this window in the Basilique Saint-Urbain in Troyes in France, a 13th century example of the kind of dark and rich coloring that the article in the Western Gazette is talking about. The article goes on to say that this type of coloring is very different from the light and silvery backgrounds usual in English 15th century work. The typical 15th century treatment was either a rich and elaborate white canopy or tabernacle above the figure or subject, or else the figure was set upon a simple background of lozenge-shaped quarries of white glass, slightly ornamented by devices in yellow stain. This latter treatment, the article goes on to say, is specially characteristic of 15th century glass in the west of England. One of the examples it gives is the stained glass from the Church of St. Mary's in East Brent in Somerset. Notice here the white lozenges behind the main figures, and also the borders of red, gold, white, and blue, which are highly reminiscent of the borders in the topmost windows of St. Catherine's Chapel. The article in the Western Gazette goes on to say that it would be interesting to speculate on the way in which the main lights of the windows which had this background, the background mentioned before, were treated. Any combination with canopy work is highly improbable. It is more likely that the principal subjects were either in one or two horizontal bands or sections cut off from the red or blue trellis background by horizontal lines and treated quite separately, somewhat as the 14th century windows are treated in Merton College, Oxford, a curious survival of the conventions of 100 years earlier. And here are the windows in Merton College Chapel, Oxford. As you can see, in the middle of the windows, there are figures separated from the rest by horizontal bands. The article in the Western Gazette also tells us about the survival and rediscovery of Sherborne Abbey's medieval glass. It cites a Times special correspondent as saying, "The glass seems to have been removed from the upper parts of the choir windows when they were filled with stained glass at the time of the munificent 19th century restoration." This is the restoration of R.C. Carpenter in 1850. When the Puritan iconoclasts destroyed stained glass, they often seem to have contented themselves with smashing the big figures or prominent subjects in the main lights of the windows, without troubling about destroying the smaller pieces of glass in the cusped heads of the lights or in the tracery. In this way, a great deal of ancient glass survived until the Victorian restorers, in an excess of zeal, substituted entirely new windows. At Sherborne, they, fortunately, put the old glass on one side instead of destroying it. The Western Gazette also reports that sub-correspondence had recently taken place with regard to the medieval glass in Sherborne Abbey. It says, "The glass was recently sent to the Victorian Albert Museum, where it was examined by stained glass experts who reported that there did not appear to be anything exactly like it elsewhere in England. It is thought to date from just after the Great Fire," it reports, about the middle of the 15th century, and although fragmentary, it includes heraldic shields of great interest, as we've seen in this video, and altogether is a most valuable collection. It was proposed to affix the glass in the windows of the ambulatory, but on account of the cost, £80, it was decided not to proceed with the work. Finally, we have a letter written to the Western Gazette around the same time, in which the author, who calls himself Catholicus, presumably Anglo-Catholicus, says that he read with great disappointment the decision of the Sherborne Abbey authorities not to proceed with the scheme for placing the 15th century glass in the windows of the ambulatory on the score of the cost, £80. Surely, he says, in a place of the size of Sherborne, and with the widely spread interest which the ancient Abbey church excites, there should be very little difficulty in raising this comparatively small sum. The decision, he says, is all the more regrettable, as the glass had been sent up to the Victorian Albert Museum and carefully examined and cleaned. Unless wiser counsels prevail, this valuable painted glass, the only relics of the medieval glazing in the church, is apparently destined to return to the obscurity and neglect to which it was consigned by the Victorian restorers. Of course, later on, money was found to restore the windows and place them not in the ambulatory, but in St. Catherine's Chapel, where they can now be visited, enjoyed, and admired. A window into the rich history and heritage of Sherborne, of Dorset, and of the west of England.